Well, hello, everyone. My name is Mitch Fastenaw, and I'm the Marketing Communications Manager here at the Iowa Soybean Association. We'd like to thank you all for joining us today and appreciate your membership with ISA. The Iowa Soybean Association is driven to deliver insights, tools, activities, and information to improve the competitiveness and profitability of Iowa's 40,000 soybean farmers. Today's webinar on relay cropping in Iowa is part of ISA's Innovation to Go series, which is led by staff at the Research Center for Farming Innovation and takes place monthly through September. Today, we're pleased to be joined by Theo Gunther, who is the Senior Research Program Development Coordinator with the Research Center for Farming Innovation. Just a few housekeeping items here before we begin. Today's webinar is designed to be highly interactive. Following Theo's presentation, he'll be available to answer your questions in real time. Please utilize the Q&A feature below to ask any questions throughout the presentation. We'll be collecting your responses and we'll have Theo answer them during the Q&A portion of today's webinar. So with that, I'll hand it over to Theo to get started.
Thanks, Mitch. Appreciate everyone joining today and coming to hear a little bit about relay cropping. And this is a project that I've been working on with cooperators around the state for the past few years, and I'm glad to share it with you and answer some questions about it. So for those that might not be familiar, or I guess here's what we're going to cover today. I want to go through a little bit of what relay cropping is, some examples of why we would want to do it, and then we also have some results from trials that have been done over the past few years that gives us some idea of performance of this system in Iowa. So we'll cover those topics. So what is relay cropping? So this is a recent definition provided by USDA RMA as to what relay cropping is. So defined as a practice where a second planted crop, the relay crop, is planted into an established crop where the crops are planted in a manner that allows separate agronomic maintenance and harvest of the crops unless otherwise defined in the crop provisions. So that's a long and legalistic way of saying that you're going to grow two crops over the same period of time and harvest them during a similar period of time, and you're going to harvest them both. So there's an image here on the left that shows two crops growing simultaneously for part of their development. When they talk about them being maintained separately, they're being planted in separate discrete events, and they're also going to be harvested in separate events. And this is going to focus primarily on the use of cereal rye and soybeans, because that is where the ISA cooperator research has been done to date. So good picture on the left there that kind of gives you a gist of what we're looking at. We've got cereal rye, or a small grain that was planted in the previous fall, soybean that was planted in the spring, and they're growing together at this time of the year as we approach small grain harvest time in the middle of summer. But they're growing together until the soybeans are kind of past the baton and growing for the remainder of the growing season. So the question of why you'd want to relay crop. So if we look at just the environmental benefits of doing this, what this system provides is soil cover and stabilization, which we know are important to long-term soil longevity and maintaining the topsoil that's out there. We're going to reduce nitrogen losses to water. This is the same way that a living root is going to be taking up nutrients and using water rather than being in a fallow situation where there's bare soil and residual fertility in the soil that could be lost to water. And we're going to increase the total biomass input of the cropping system. So when we plant soybeans as a sole crop, they really don't grow a whole lot until the beginning or the middle of June. And what this system provides is the same way that a small grain cover crop works, is that you're going to have something growing out there immediately after the ground thaws out in the spring, and it's going to be using nutrients and water that would otherwise be turned into a loss. So an example of this is really visual. This is from a field visit to these sites in some sites in the northern tier counties of Iowa on the 15th of June. And while we were visiting this site, there was an 1.5 inch rain that occurred over about a 45-minute time period. This would be obviously mid-June, where there's, and looking at this picture, there's a large amount of ground cover out there. That rye is headed out. It's approaching peak biomass, and as that storm rolls in, that rain is going to meet that rye at the ground level. When we go by a nearby field, we have substantial runoff. So this is a soybean field that the beans were approaching their second or third trifoliate, but there's still a lot of bare soil out there. There's a lot of that water running off and being lost. And what this system does is allows that to soak in. It provides an opportunity for water to be used earlier and create more space for the events, for a heavy rain event like occurred at those sites. So while this is just one example of how it can be environmentally beneficial, when you get a hard rain like that, there's others along with that I mentioned before about soil stabilization and nitrogen use. Some economic benefits that can occur from this system. The obvious is that you're doing 2 marketable grain crops. That's the primary driver. But beyond just having more marketable product coming out of that any individual acre, you also potentially have lower herbicide needs. So very few, or I guess none, of these trial sites where relay cropping has been done are they using a pre-emergent herbicide program. They're often doing a post small grain or post rye harvest application of herbicide just to clean up weeds. But there's very few out there relative to if you have just a sole crop planted into a no rye cover. So there's much lower herbicide need. And you convert that nitrogen and water that's drained, instead becomes biomass and grain. So I didn't realize that rhymes a little bit, but that's what's happening. You're turning or nitrogen and water that could otherwise be lost from the system into biomass and grain that becomes that main point at the top, a marketable product. And so multi-cropping Iowa through the Northeast Iowa RC&D had done some basic surveying of these farmers that are doing this. And this shows that they're finding this system to be profitable. Now, not in all cases is it more profitable than sole crop soybean, but the costs are similar, and the upside potential is there. So while the average, both the average and the median of the farmers surveyed where they've had these two compared, we're showing an advantage to yield. Obviously, there's some wide ranges there, so take it with a grain of salt, and your experience may differ. But we're turning what is otherwise just a winter annual cover crop and taking advantage of the same results that would occur from a cover crop, but harvesting another grain crop at the same time, that same season. So I'll get into a little bit of detail here about the trials that we performed over the past few years. So beginning in 2020, we started doing replicated strip trials with farmers around the state. And there's pins in this map that show where those cooperators are located. And for every blank area in that map, not only is there other farmers that are interested or doing this practice, they just didn't happen to be doing a trial. So this is the location where we've actually had people execute replicated strip trials comparing sole crop and relay crop systems, and where we've had some data collected. So the main point is this can work in many different parts of the state. I know that there's interest in a lot of different parts of the state, and we rely on farmer cooperators to gather this data and make these comparisons. So if you're in one of these gaps and you want better data, you can work with us to help accomplish that. And in 2022, we have trials in these pin locations here. So the upper tier, those three trials in northern Iowa include hybrid rye. So they have another kind of variation on the system, but we're performing additional sole crop versus relay crop comparisons at these locations in 2022. So I mentioned the three trials that have hybrid rye included in them. Picture on the left here kind of shows a how we would lay this out. So these are standard replicated strips. They're alternating with different treatments. So we've got three, actually four here, because that far right hybrid rye wider block is going to be harvested on different edges, and that'll be part of the replication. And there's also some sole crop strips in here that just aren't showing up on the planting map. But that picture on the right is from that visit on the 8th of July, so last Friday, and this is of the hybrid rye. And so there you can see a few soybeans kind of hiding there in the bottom of that rye canopy, but there's a large potential rye crop out there for this system, and it was like this at all three of those locations. And so there's a lot of potential we're gonna get some data on here in the next few weeks as these are harvested. And some more detail on what that is if you're not familiar. Hybrid rye is shown here on the left. It's been developed by KWS out of Europe, and then they brought it to Canada and other parts of North America and United States as well. And you can see there just the difference in growth habits. So it's a little bit shorter, or it's at a consistent height, where the open pollinated rye, which is what most people are working with, which is your VNS, your roostocks, your Elbons, your different types of varieties for cereal rye that are open pollinated. So lower yield potential. They have a wider flowering period so that they have higher disease susceptibility, and they don't have that hybrid vigor that the hybrid does on the left. The downside is that you can't save the hybrid rye back for seed to use it as cover crop. So in this case, we're testing it on a few acres, and so there's not a huge amount. There's not going to be a huge glut of hybrid rye that they're looking to get rid of. But we really wanted to make the comparison between the open pollinated and the hybrid rye for both the effect of the rye yield, but also differences in the effect on the soybean crop as well. That's planted underneath this that you just can't really see very well. Oops. So here's that picture again, same location on the 8th of July, and we're approaching harvest. You can see the open pollinated is getting closer to harvest. It's matured a little bit sooner than the hybrid, and but the hybrid rye is approaching maturity as well. And this is very northern tier county of Iowa, and so they're going to be, obviously a slightly shorter growing season. If this were further south, they'd probably be ready to harvest now, or at least by the end of this week. So, but just a good visual difference between those types and that we're comparing in this system. Again, when you pull back that rye canopy, you can see the soybeans growing in there. So some observed differences here is the open pollinated. It's taller, it doesn't have that hybrid vigor, and it's more susceptible to lodging. So some of those strips have issues with lodging, which is a major consideration for when you're trying to harvest that over a soybean canopy. If it lodges early in the growing season and gets down into the soybean canopy, you're going to open more light up. Those beans are going to grow into it, and it's going to be very difficult to recover any of that grain. So there's some management considerations that have to be taken into account here on just logistically how you're going to get that out, and then how can you use the tools like variety selection and other management strategies to make sure that you're actually going to have something harvestable. No different than any other crop. You just got some different considerations. But those beans on the left side that are growing in that canopy, there's solid rows there of beans that have several trifoliate leaves formed on them, many nodes, and they're going to continue to grow as soon as that rye is removed off the top of them. and take advantage of that available sunlight for the rest of the growing season. A lot of potential here. And then we have other trials that are looking at the VNS rye, so the open pollinated non-hybrid rye, and a sole crop comparison. So these are some pictures from some of those trials showing the replicated strips. Almost all of these, well, all of them, with the exception of maybe one, where the sole crop is represented by a soybean planted at the same time as the relay, and then having a termination event with a herbicide to kill off the sole crop system's rye, and that becomes the treatment for sole crop. So these are almost exclusively farmers that are using cover crops, and they're growing seed either for their own use or sometimes for sale as well. So they're marketing this rye locally to farmers that want it for cover crop seed. So when you look at these previous years replicated strip trials, some things to keep in mind. So these trials were, the baseline requirement is that you have some rye planted in your field in the fall. And some of the cooperators intended to do relay cropping when they planted that rye. And some sites were a springtime decision where people were kind of on the fence. They're like, oh, that's kind of cool. I'd like to understand it. I'd like to try it. And what I convinced them to do is to do a replicated comparison and contribute the data. So they actually had that comparison on their farm of their sole crop potential and the relay system in the same year. But that means, I just say that to show that farmers came into this with different goals and at different levels of experience. The trials vary in rye variety, which is, some of these are VNS, others are, that might be third generation saved on the farm, so it doesn't have that vigor. Some of them are specific varieties like Elbon or Rootstock, where they purchase that seed as a variety. So there's a big range here in the rye genetics. There's differences in soybean relative maturity. The higher, the better, to a point in this. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But there's some differences in relative maturity that are a big driver in what your soybean yield potential are. There's also various row configurations, and this goes into the last point as well, is that all of the equipment used to manage this was what the farmers had. And so engineering by inventory, this is using what you got and trying to make it work. Not always the perfect piece of equipment to manage the system. And when you're doing it on, maybe 20 acres of your entire farm, it's hard to justify going out and purchasing any specialty equipment to manage the system. That equipment does exist, but it's hard to justify. So when we look at the yield results here, this is what came off of the combine in the yield monitor data, and has all of these sort of caveats built into it about what we've been able to do in the last 2 years. So, I got a typo there. 2020 through 2021 trials. This is the table that shows it all. These are the summary of all of the replicated strip trials that have included a relay rye soybean and a sole crop soybean treatment, along with the maturity group, location, and then also some information about the row configuration for each of those sites. And I've highlighted their 4 trials that have had really that were kind of the shining stars, right? So they're getting 80% up to 91% of the sole crop of the sole crop yield that occurred in the soybeans right next to them. And that really, I think, shows the potential of the system. You'll see that each of them had high maturity groups, a relatively high maturity group for Iowa, getting late, high 3s, or at least in the three maturity group. And so that's an important consideration. And oftentimes, getting between 30 and 40 bushels of rye off of those same acres. And so those are some of the most profitable acres these farmers tell me on their farms, right? When they can achieve that type of sole crop soybean soybean yield as compared to a sole crop, and they have an additional 30 to 40 bushels of cereal rye that offset their costs to maintain that practice on their farm or sell the seed. That's where this this system really shines in terms of profitability. There's other situations where we had lower sole crop soybean or lower relay soybean yields as compared to the sole crop. And a lot of that's driven by maturity group, weather considerations, and also farmer goals. So some locations where they were really focused on growing rye for seed, they're not trying to, they want as much soybean yield as they can, but that's not their primary goal. So take what you want from this slide and from these results, but I think it shows the potential of the system pretty clearly. Some considerations I mentioned before. So you want to be at the high end of your relative maturity for your area, maybe a half group higher or more. This is to make sure that you are taking advantage of the entire growing season. So these soybeans are, they're going to be planted. You want to plant them as soon as possible with the longest potential for growth and for vegetative growth. You want those soybeans to still be vegetative at the time of rye harvest. If they're flowering, they're starting to flower, that's fine. But if they don't have a vegetative growth period left after that rye canopy is removed, then they're going to sit there and you've lost the yield. The soybeans in the sole crop comparison at the time of rye harvest are always going to be larger than the relay crop soybeans. But once that rye canopy is removed, there's still plenty of time left on the clock if you've got a longer relative maturity for the months or the end of July through the end of September, and sometimes even into October to finish those soybeans out. So you really have to give this system the entirety of the growing season for it to be successful, and that's the way that the farmers that have done this have had the most success. Late and early frosts have been a risk, but they have not been a problem in these trials. So some of the sites in northern Iowa had a late frost and the beans were in there. They were just emerging, but they have a full canopy of rye above them, which helped protect them from that mild frost. Late in the season, we've had some frosts that have hit the top of soybeans that were just finishing up, that are yellowing leaves. They're just starting to finish up maturing, but it didn't affect the quality of the soybeans, and there wasn't a huge loss associated with that early first light frost. So that all said, you really need to take advantage of the entire growing season to make this system work. That's where managing that risk and thinking that, recognizing that these are going to be the first soybeans in the ground usually, and the last ones out of the field. So you really get to see them all the way through from the beginning into the end of the growing season. Again, soybean potential, 80 to 90% of sole crop yield possible. We showed that in those trials. Several of those trials in 2021, those fields had record soybean yields for those fields, record field numbers for those fields. You see this picture here on the right, sole crop on the left, relay crop on the right. This was a field that did, plus 70 bushels in the sole crop and was, maybe 8 or 9 bushels behind on relay. And so, that's, the potential's there. I'll stop reiterating that. What other considerations are required depends on the goal. So some of these farmers, as I mentioned, are focused on seed production. Whatever they can get from a soybean crop on the second half is a bonus. When you are, others are looking to how little of effect can I have on my soybean, and I need to get enough seed to plant all my acres to cover crops and have that cost savings for my overall farm operation. So different goals that could be achieved with this system. But there's been minimal research on soil yield responses to many management methods. So I talk about differences in nitrogen inputs, any sort of product that's going to be beneficial to soybeans, and are promoted as providing yield advantage or have a scenario where they work well. None of them are really tested in a relay setup. Everything's focused on sole crop soybeans, which makes sense. But I think there's a big opportunity there for research, and there's ways to get those soil yields higher if you're going to grow a relay system. So the big picture here that's possible here is we've got two potential markets for this rye. Soybeans, pretty well defined market. There's buyers and processors and that around the state. But the rye cover crop seed market is where most of these cooperators are operating, right? They're using open pollinated or VNS varieties. And they're growing rye seed so that they can cover their acres to get improved water quality, to generate some forage, to stabilize their soil. So basically what you get from a cover crop, what your goal would be with a cover crop. The hybrid rye, on the other hand, we're talking about volume of rye seed. So if you're getting 50 to 100, even sometimes the hybrid rye can do more than 100. I don't know if it would in a relay system. I don't know if that would be the goal. But when you're getting rye yields pushing 70 plus bushels, you really need to have a place for that to go. The swine feed market is the obvious place for that to go. It's compatible as far as part of swine rations. There's not a reduction in growth or quality of the pork that would come out of that, and it's a high volume market that could drive adoption. Now, that's all very conceptual. There's good examples internationally of people using rye as a feed, but it's a matter of infrastructure, and it's a matter of having somebody that's willing to buy it and feed it to make that happen. But if we're talking about maximizing biomass production and maximizing grain output from this system, hybrid rye is going to do it. It's going to provide quality feed. And then if we can minimize or get comparable yields on soybeans that strike that balance, that's where it can really shine and might be there in the future. So I wanted to highlight some open research questions. I tried to manage expectations with what we've been able to do so far with the sole crop versus relay crop trials, because there's a lot of things we don't know. The hybrid rye, we're gonna have the first data on that in 2022. That should be coming out of the field here in the next couple of weeks. Plant population studies, there haven't been a lot of comparisons on how many tillers you want of rye versus to not affect soybean development or to maximize soybean development. There just hasn't been a lot of carefully crafted studies that compare those different variables. We know for relative maturity of soybeans that it needs to be higher than or at the high end of what would be appropriate for a sole crop field, but we don't know how high. There's not been a lot of comparisons on that. Similar to the population studies, they would be straightforward. We also haven't looked at a lot of different phenotypes in this system. So whether they're upright, high branching, what's going to be the best for this system. There hasn't been a lot of detailed research on the different options that exist out there. Wheel traffic is a big one. Yield loss, the sites that had the 80 to 90% soy yield, my inclination is that a lot of that yield reduction was due to, or some, not all of it, obviously, but some of that yield loss was wheel traffic. So combines running over a row, sometimes they're pinching off or they're moving around plants that the wheels are next to. So there's wheel traffic is a big issue in this situation, in this system. if you're trying to find a combine with the most narrow wheels possible, which a lot of combines in this state are, they have a lot of tire. There's a lot of tire track that goes down through there, and if you're going to go through a growing canopy of plants, you're going to do some damage. So wheel traffic is something that there hasn't been a lot of research on, and it has not been studied in this system, to my knowledge. There's still a lot of questions about fertility. We're using basic fertility guidelines for small grains. Most of these farmers are doing either a dry blend of fertilizer in the spring. Sometimes they're using the liquid systems on their planter when they plant soybeans, and then directing the stream out towards the rye plants. But questions about fertility, in particular for soybeans, if you're banding nutrients to where you plan to have that row, fertilizing both of the crops. There's just questions that could be explored there to really maximize yield, and to make sure that one of the crops isn't getting shorted at the expense of the other. Other winter annuals, there's people doing this with wheat in other parts of the country. There's at least one researcher that's doing this with canola and soybeans in Canada, and there's possibly others. But this idea of growing multiple plants together at the same time is not new. It's just, what's the market for it? What's the application? And then how do you take the different management options that are available and arrange them in a way that's going to maximize your yield potential, and give you some of those ground cover environmental benefits that that you'd want from your system. So a lot of open research questions here. It's for farmers that are considering this, you've got a lot of things to think about. And if you're thinking about how it might perform in a specific field, any of these topics could be considered for research, and could be worked on with ISA. One such is, I talk about wheel traffic. This is one cooperator. He's not doing a trial this year, but he's looking at trying to minimize wheel traffic by using sort of a thicker band through the field, 10-inch rye rows, triple 10-inch rye rows on 60-inch centers, and then planting the beans in that same space between there, so that the combine can go through there without running over a whole row of soybeans. And the thought is that when you have that band of beans, they're going to grow off into that rye space once they get a chance. So they'll try and fill that canopy, and we'll see how it goes. Data coming soon. And I guess the other things I mentioned, fertility, I just want to reiterate that. Mineral comparisons on these fields varied in their background fertility availability. Some of them had a history of manure, others were really light ground with no history of manure. Some had dry blends, some had planter applied end. Many of them followed corn, which from a disease management consideration for small grains in Iowa is a problem, because you have buildup of fusarium. Fusarium is going to lower the quality and the yield potential of the small grain. So there's rotation and management effects. We've just taken the cooperators that are interested in doing this, where they're starting from. Some of them had done this for multiple years, others had not done this at all. So what we represent, or what I represent in that table summary, is really just a combination of all takers who wanted to participate in this research. So those ones that are at the high end of the yield potential are really what excites me about this system, because I know it's possible with the right management. And research is going to be important to narrowing those down and making this system really tight in its execution. So I wanted to highlight some, so that's all I have for today. I want to highlight some project sponsors. Northeast Iowa RC&D with their Multi-Cropping Iowa initiative. They have been a great partner on this with myself and ISA. And they're kind of a clearinghouse for information about this. interactions with farmers who are sharing this on social media. We've also had some support financially from the Fishers and Farmers Initiative, which is through the Fish and Wildlife Service. And really their interest is, do we have a system that can produce, that can assist in adoption of cover crops and trying to keep nitrate and sediment out of streams? Is that the way that can happen? And then this last growing season, KWS, which is the sole supplier of hybrid rye, provided some seed and some support to get those hybrid rye comparisons included in the research project for 2022. So some great partners, but again, and all of the farmers that have contributed to this, cooperating farmers have done, they manage the plots, they share the data. We couldn't do this without them. So I appreciate everything that's been done by them. And if you're looking for people to keep tabs on or follow on social media or on Twitter, there's 4 listed there. Those are people who are out there sharing their experiences about this practice, that have a lot of experience with it, and are very transparent about what they're doing, and would love to tell you some more. So please check them out when you get a chance. So that's all I have. Oh, other than that, I do want to encourage you, if you are interested in this, in doing a trial, or you're interested in the data that was presented today, my colleagues in Northeast Iowa and Southeast Iowa, Alex and Anthony, are available to connect with you. They have experience working with me on this project. They know the cooperators, they know who to connect with. And if you're interested in having a trial at your farm, or you're interested in more data or have questions, we rely on farmers driving the questions that we ask in a lot of cases. So if you have interest in this system and want more information, or want to participate in a research project, please reach out to my colleagues, Alex and Anthony, in Northeast and Southeast Iowa. That's all I have. I'll hand it back off to Mitch here for a second, and then we'll get into the Q&A.
All right, thanks, Theo. Looks like we have a couple questions that came in. Just a reminder, if you have any questions, to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. Theo, the first question for you, what is the sample size on revenue cost?
So there was, I guess I have the spreadsheet right there, but I believe 9, there was 9 locations where we had both the sole crop and the relay crop system compared. So not a huge sample size, but there's not a lot of locations where we have good comparable data. So again, these are farmer reported values. They're going to account for any cost savings in, well, if they're reducing herbicide use, they're assigning a value to the cereal rye. Their value of market on, or the value that they are able to market their soybeans for, varied in these years. So it's possible to do a more detailed budget of this, but really, at least at this point, what it comes down to is what the farmers see as their profitability, and what savings they can achieve, and how they value it. So that's why it's just included in that way. But yeah, it's not a very big sample size. We'd like to make it bigger.
All right, and next question, have you seen any insect problems?
There's been some, not any worse than anywhere else for the soybeans. On the small grain side, the biggest issue is foliar fungal diseases and head diseases on the rye. If you're getting dinged really bad on the rye yields, that rye is present there intercepting light that would otherwise go to those soybeans, whether it's producing viable grain or not. And when you get into issues with disease, and you're intercepting that light that would otherwise go down to soybeans below, that's where it can really hurt you. So insects, no. but it's not that it couldn't happen, but most of the pest issues have been foliar and fungal diseases.
All right. So we had a few more questions that have come in here. Speaking of the fungal diseases, is fungicide necessary for rye?
So all of these trials, most of them have included a fungicide for the rye. It's especially with the VNS rye, it's almost mandatory if you want to have good viable seed, if you want to sell it for seed. If you don't, then most of the time you're going to have low test weights. You're not going to have great high quality seed to be able to sell. It's not going to clean well. It can be done without it, but at your own risk. I would recommend one the same way with that most small grains are grown in Iowa and in a humid environment. With the hybrid, I don't know if it's as necessary. The opportunity for infection on the small grain is much smaller because of the way that it pollinates in a short period of time. So it's less susceptible to some really harmful diseases. And you know, it's up to the cooperator, and there's different strategies that people can use to make that work. But I would recommend one, especially if you're growing open pollinated VNS types, and especially if you're following corn, because there's a lot of inoculum there for fusarium right there in the field after if you're planted right into corn.
All right. Next question. How is yield reporting for crop insurance and or FSA handled?
So to date, people doing this have most of the time, well, not most of the time, there's not insurance available. These are uninsured, which is a problem. Now, as I mentioned at the very beginning, RMA is looking to offer cover crop, or not cover crop, offer insurance products for relay cropping. The challenge is there's just not a lot of data about what percentage of a sole crop should be insurable, and so that's the deal. You know, these are small total acres at this point, and so most of the cooperators have been foregoing insurance for this because they can't get products offered to them, insurance products for these acres.
All right, we got a few more questions that have come in. Again, please continue submitting any questions that you have. Next question, has anyone done this in the hills?
The hills. One cooperator in southwestern Iowa has done this in a field that has more changes in elevation than what we had in northeastern or southeastern Iowa. I wouldn't, call it the hills. If you're talking about, highly contoured terraced land, it's possible. But yeah, your wheel traffic really becomes your limiting factor there, and whether you can stay on those rows, and then how much yield you're giving up, or how much soybean you're running down with your combine, I think is going to be your biggest consideration there. So yes, there's one cooperator that has done some, but it was in a spot of the field that he could plant in straight rows. It wasn't on highly contoured or terraced ground.
All right. Were most people planting into bean stubble, or was it worked corn ground? If a person is no-till planting into bean stubble, would it be better? So
the best yields and the best conditions for small grains are going to be following soybeans. The cooperators that are growing rye for seed, they're looking to follow soybeans for the exact reason that you stated, or that the questioner stated. it's going to have less residue. You're going to get more consistent stands in the fall. And you're going to have soybean after soybean. So you have to manage that risk for diseases, insects, etc. Worked corn ground, or most of the trials that followed corn, these are no-till farmers that did this. So they are, they might be using a little bit more aggressive row cleaning ahead of planting it when they're planting their rye. But yeah, that's an issue when planting into high yielding soy or high yielding crop residue from corn, if you're going to go no-till. So yeah, that's one of the management considerations that we really haven't teased out of this data. The farmers that we've worked with to date have all been no-till, whether that's planting the rye into corn or soybeans.
All right, and another question here, do you need RTK accuracy to plant and combine?
No, but it doesn't hurt. If you're going to maintain your a row configuration where you're trying to split an existing row, you'll want RTK. If you're going to leave a space, you want to hit the middle of it. Otherwise, you're going to have slower development of that soybean, and it's going to be competing closer to those plant roots. On the other hand, there's one cooperator who just drills the rye and then comes back in early in the spring and drills the soybeans right into it. And then when it's time to combine, just drives right through it. And it's a matter of what you're comfortable with. You're going to get the or what works for your area. If you're, and what kind of planting equipment you have. If you have a drill and that's what you have and you want to try it, plant the rye and then come back and plant the soybeans at a slight angle so that you're not tearing up every single row the same way that you went into it. And then when it's time to combine, just don't be squeamish and keep driving and see what happens. But I in my opinion, maintaining some row control is a benefit. You can still get the weed control benefits of the rye. You can potentially band or include nutrients when you plant the soybeans, or do any sort of other management. You can manage the crops separately better when you have that separation, and especially if you're getting into the hybrid rye. That seed's expensive, and so you don't want to be running stuff down and damaging things unnecessarily, unless you're just using what you have, and you have no other options.
All right, we had a couple more come in here that we'll get through. What row spacing seems most common?
The most common is to do a twin row on a 30-inch center. Most of the trials have had farmers that have set up their drills with a twin row setup on a 30-inch center, and then coming back and planting the soybeans in between that in 30-inch rows. There's some that have used their 15-inch spacing planter to plant the rye, and then again for the soybeans. Whether maintaining a 30 or putting 15s in between each one of those 15-inch rye rows. I don't know if I can say which one is better. I think that for my personal opinion is that if you're able to do a twin row setup to allow a space for light to get down to that soybean so that it continues to develop, then when that canopy is opened up after rye harvest, that soybean is going to be as far along in its development as it had the potential to. So really, with that setup, you're reducing shading. But then again, I don't know for sure, because like I showed that picture of the cooperator who did basically 30-inch bands of soybeans alternating with the triple row 10-inch, and then same thing with the soybeans. It's how do you manage the light in that canopy? How are you getting light down to those soybeans that are going to be released later, and take advantage of as much of that space as possible. So I like the twin rows right now because that's what I've seen the most of and I've seen it work, but that doesn't mean that's the only way to do it.
All right. Another question here. What do you think about drilling small grain and cross planting the soybeans and burning down the grain in the soybean row?
So doing kind of a banded herbicide application, I think is what they're describing. That could work. The issue with trying to kill or trying to spray the area right around the soybean plant is that no matter how good you are, you're going to be doing some damage to those adjacent rows that you're trying to take to maturity. And what I've seen happen on the edges of these trials or of the edges of these strips is that you'll have a few rows of 1 or 2 rows of rye that got a partial rate of herbicide, and they still look like rye, but you go up and there's no grain in the heads. And so again, you're intercepting light that's ahead of in front of your soybeans that's not being converted into grain. And so you got to be really careful doing that. And it's better just to let things grow, keep the herbicides away from it, and just planning ahead to reduce the incidence of that. Because otherwise, you could end up doing major damage to your rye crop, and then it's not even worth having there. You might as well just burn the whole thing down.
All right. And it looks like we have one last question here. What methods are being used for rye harvest?
So I didn't focus on that too much. There's 2 main methods. People either using a row crop head when they're in a twin row configuration, and then lining up the gathering mechanism there to pull in those twin rows and harvest the grain off of the rye. What that does is it puts the snoot right over the soybean row, and that's just kind of pushing down those soybeans as it goes over it. And then those twin rows of rye are getting gathered into the mechanism there and harvested. That's one way. All crop row heads are not super common in Iowa. There's not a lot of those sitting around, but they are a thing, and they work really well in a twin row setup. Otherwise, most people are using their soybean harvesting head and blocking parts of the bar, and just making sure that the soybeans aren't getting clipped off by that cutting bar and then going through the combine. So I've seen this done with people have made different things like shoes or push them down. There's a company out of Canada that makes kind of trying to think of the right word. It's like a ski almost that pushes down. It attaches to the header, pushes those soybeans down in front of the cutting bar, so that keeps those from getting cut off. There's also people that I've seen just go and stick a piece of plastic, take some polycarbonate, bend it over, and attach it to the cutter bar to block those knives that are right where the soybeans are. I've seen pieces of PVC cut or of drain tile cut to the width of the row for the soybeans and stuck on there. That's engineering by inventory, and that's a Lawrence Steinlage quote. Use what you got, and there's a lot of different ways to get after it. But the all crop heads work well in twin rows. Everything else I've seen is with is where you're blocking part of the cutter bar, and then there's also the strategy of just going right through it. You're going to clip some heads of soybeans or some growing points, but just trying to manage the height of those knives so that they minimize damage and gather damage to the soybeans and gather as much of the rye on the platform as possible.
All right, we do have a couple more questions that came in. I know we're pushing the hour here, so we'll get through these and then call it good. But would you have any images of the harvest process and how they are working?
I have some images that have been shared with me by cooperators, but I don't have any. I guess I could show those as a comparison or put you in contact with the farmers that have tried different ones. But I have not done any research or data gathering on those different methods. We haven't compared methods in the same field. So that's one limitation of the research, is we've just kind of taken the data as farmers have used their whatever method they are using to harvest. So I don't have a good comparison between those to show what the yield losses are, or I guess the differences in yield between different harvest methods. But we do have some images. There's some in the presentation, and if there's more, it's possible to follow up and share those other images with the person who asked.
All right, and then the last question, does the enlist 2 to 4D negatively affect the yield of cereal rye?
I do not know. There's, for small grains, in particular wheat, there's a lot of plant growth regulators that are used in wheat production. I haven't explored the use of those in this system. We have not, there's not been 2,4-D applied to these plots, and so I can't comment on how that would work. I know that the enlist system, some of the soybeans that have been planted in this are enlist soybeans, and so following rye harvest, they'll use the different traded chemistries, or the different chemistries that are available for those traits to do a burn down and to clean up the soybeans following rye harvest. But I have no idea how it affects the cereal rye.
All right, well, that looks like we got through all the questions. Thank you everyone for submitting questions, and I want to give a huge shout out to Theo for sharing his expertise with the group today. To all the attendees, we trust that you found today's webinar beneficial as you continue making decisions for your operation this year. Today's discussion is the 5th in an ongoing series of Innovation to Go webinars, which take place each month through September. The next webinar will take place on Tuesday, August 2nd, and it will focus on drainage water recycling for crop production and water quality. To register for this opportunity or to complete a research trial interest form, visit iasoybeans.com. Again, that's iasoybeans.com. And on behalf of the Iowa Soybean Association, we thank you for joining us today.